The great island of Numenor was a gift from the Valar to the houses of the Edain, those men who had aided the Valar in the wars against the Dark Lord Morgoth. Their first king would be Elros, the brother of Elrond, who would choose a mortal life to lead his people in their newly found homeland. Numenor would flourish throughout the Second Age of Middle-earth, greater in both mind and body by comparison to the lesser men of the world. In addition, they were gifted with longer lifespans, exceeding more than double that of their distant kin. During the later years of the Second Age, the ruling king of Numenor, Pharazon, would be corrupted by the deceiver Sauron. He desired immortality like that of the elven race, and would sail to Valinor into the west with a great fleet to claim that which Sauron had promised him. Instead, marching upon the Undying Lands, Pharazon's army would face the wrath of Eru Ilúvatar and be buried as the world would be sundered and reshaped, splitting Valinor from Middle-earth and sinking the Isle of Numenor beneath the waves. Fortunately, a fleet of 9 ships had set sail eastbound to Middle-earth, carrying those Numenorians faithful to the Valar, led by Elendil the Tall. Along with his 2 sons Isildur and Anarion, they would form the realms of Arnor and Gondor. With Elendil taking the position of High King, he would reside in the city of Arnuminas in Arnor, while Isildur would found the city of Minas Ithil and Anarion Minas Anor, later known as Minas Tirith. Their realms would be joined at its center by Osgiliath. Following the creation of the Rings of Power and Sauron's rise across Middle-earth, the Numenorians would join with the elves and other free peoples of Middle-earth to fight against the Dark Lord, eventually defeating him, but at a great cost. Many lives were lost during the battles, including Anarion. The greatest loss of all, however, was that of Elendil, who had been slain by Sauron during the siege of Barad-dûr. Though not all would be lost, as Isildur, the last surviving son of Elendil, would take up the broken remains of Narsil, the sword of his father, and cut the One Ring from Sauron's hand, finally defeating the fallen Maiar. For now. Isildur would claim the One Ring for his own as Wergild for the loss of his father and brother, and would take it with him north to claim his right as the High King. However, he would never complete that journey. Well, that's enough of that very abridged lore, so let's get on to painting some models. Welcome back to Mini-Earth, where in this episode, I'm going to paint up a whole lot of classic metal Numenorian warriors. These models were released way back in 2001 at the beginning of the game's release, sculpted by Michael and Alan Perry and initially released as Men of Gondor, available in blister packs of either 3 spearmen or 3 bowmen, with 4 different poses for each type. Fortunately, these models are still available from Games Workshop today as a 3-pack, at least whenever they're actually in stock. It's also worth noting that they are now appropriately called Numenorians instead of Men of Gondor, and as expected, the price has changed too, of course. So between picking up some new packs from GW and a few small lots off eBay, I've ended up with a lot of 12 spearmen and 12 bowmen to paint up, so it's time to get started. Since these are metal models, they come with a lot of mold lines and flashing, so after getting those all cleaned up, I glued any spearman arms on that had come separate and then attached them to their slaughter bases. Once prepped, they were given a prime of black using Vallejo's Black Model Primer, and then they were ready to go. I began with the armor and chainmail areas using Army Painter's polished silver speed paint. While painting the armor, I thought I'd tell you a fun little behind the scenes fact you might not know about the armor pieces used for the movie costumes. It's actually just the 3rd Age Minas Tirith style armor, but without the pauldrons and a different helmet. They then covered up the breastplate with the tabard and a little leather panel over the belt buckle, and then you had yourself a completely different era of armor. Anyway, back to the model. Next up was to start painting the skin tones using Viejo Natural Flesh, and once dry, was given a wash of Reichland Flesh Shade. I then went back to the armour, giving it a nice wash over with Nuln Oil. Next, I used some Viejo gunmetal to overbrush the spear tip and armour parts, trying to get a nice blend between the washed base coat and dark recesses going up into the sections that would be catching more light. Then, using Viejo Air Chrome, I carefully highlighted the edges and raised details on the warriors. For all the gold areas, I used Retributor armour, starting with the gold trimmed areas on the helmet, being very careful to paint thin lines of gold where needed, as the lack of detail on these sculpts don't really point to where it needs to go, so it's always handy to have reference images on hand if replicating the schemes used for the film costumes. I also used gold for the sword hilts, as well as the details on the scabbard and quivers. I then took out Viejo Chrome again and very subtly dry brushed and highlighted it over the gold areas. Getting back to the faces, having given the wash plenty of time to dry, I took out Viejo Natural Flesh again and started to highlight up the details again, like the nose, chin, brow and cheekbones. I then did a final edge highlight using Viejo Fairy Flesh just to really make the small details pop. Now it's eye time. Using Pro Acryl Bold Titanium White, I carefully filled in the whites of the eyes. I then used some black paint on the very tip of a fine brush and dotted in the pupils. To finish off the faces, there's one particular sculpt of Spearman yelling with his mouth open, so for those, I used some salmon pink from Viejo to paint the tongue, then using pale sand, I carefully painted in the teeth. It was now time to move on to the clothing, which was all the same colour, black. With some Viejo Dark Grey, I started to bring some highlights out on the cloak and tabard, where I painted it all on the outer folds and creases in the fabric. I then used the same colour to base coat the main part of the scabbard, as well as the sword belt and quiver. For the next highlight, I used Viejo Neutral Grey to bring those previous details out even more, but in much finer detail. For the final highlight, I used Sky Grey from Viejo and very thinly added final touch highlights to the top areas of details in the areas required, avoiding overdoing it and adding just enough to really make these stand out on the tabletop. For any models with shields, I wanted to show the subtle effect of the separate slats of wood you see on the film shields, so taking dark grey, I started to paint vertical lines to show the separate panels making up the shield. The panels were then given an additional highlight of neutral grey, further defining the detail. I then very thinly watered down my black paint on my palette to a thin, washy glaze and applied it over the face of the shield, bringing down the intensity of my shield panels, layering it on even thicker towards the bottom. I then did this same glaze to bring down the highlights on the cloak a little, trying to keep it looking closer to black fabric than grey. I then used pale sand to paint in the under tunic, which sticks out below the tabard and inside the arms, being very careful not to get any on the black fabrics I'd already painted. These sections were then given a wash of Citadel Contrast Skeleton Horde, before highlighting back up with pale sand again once the wash had dried, and a final highlight with some white mixed in. For the trims on the tabard and other areas, I mixed dark sand with dark grey to get the colour I wanted and applied it to all the trim and tree detailing on the model's outfit. I mainly did this to try and just get a subtle bit of variation in colour, since it's mostly just greys and blacks. These details were then highlighted using Viejo Stonewall Grey. Keeping with Stonewall Grey, I painted the belt buckle, which again is just a piece of leather with a white tree of Numenor that was used to cover up the brass 3rd Age Minas Tirith warrior buckles when filming these costumes. This was then highlighted with Sky Grey. Using Army Painter Bootstrap Brown, I base coated the gloves on each model. These were then all given a wash of Agrax Earthshade. Once dried, these were then highlighted up again with Bootstrap Brown. Then, using Leather Brown from Army Painter, I gave the gloves a final highlight. I used Rhinox hide to paint all the wooden areas on the models, such as the bows, arrows, and spear shafts. I then started building up highlights with Viejo Burned Flesh. To do the arrow fletchings, I started with dark grey as the base, before moving up to neutral grey and then finally sky grey. All a pretty familiar recipe on this model by this point. Getting back to the shield, it was time to do the silver trim and tree detail. Taking Chrome Air from Viejo, I carefully applied it to the raised details like the trims, tree and crown. I then grabbed Retributor armor again and painted on the gold stars. To finish up the shield, I gave all the silver detailing a black wash to dull down the shine and give it a more weathered look. Next to do was the little flag on the spears. I started by giving them a base coat of corn red, followed by a highlight of Viejo flat red, and a final edge highlight of dark vermilion. I'm getting near the end now, and one of the last pieces left to paint was the hair. I decided to go with a couple of different shades of brown to add a little variety. The first was starting with a base of Rhinox hide, then highlighting with Mournfang brown. Then, for the second hair colour, I went for a more sandy brown, starting with a base of Viejo Earth. This was then washed using AK Pure Grime, then highlighted back up again with the base colour, with a mix of earth and pale sand for the final highlight. Now I somehow either lost the footage of me freehand painting the stars on the spear flags or just forgot to hit record, so all I have is this photo. But basically it's just 4 lines crossing at the centre forming a star shape. It took a little while doing both sides of each flag 12 times, but I think the finished product turned out pretty great. One final detail I almost forgot about was to paint in the little straps attaching the armour to the wrists on the inside of the arms. I did this using dark grey with a neutral grey highlight. Now finally, it was basing time. I wanted these to match my last Alliance elves I had previously done, going for a rocky Mordor base. So I pulled out the Grimdark Rubble base ready from Geek Gaming Scenics again and applied basing glue to the model before dunking them in the rubble mix. Next, I painted all my base rims with Rhinox hide. Then I took out my jar of Viejo Natural Umber pigment and dusted the bottom ends of the cloaks and added a few random spatters to the base. And now for the final touch. I grabbed some dry and burnt grass tufts from Gamer's Grass and stuck them to all the bases. And with that, these Numenor Warriors are done, so it's time to show them off. pretty happy overall with how these turned out, and they look great set up as a big unit of soldiers. I always wanted these models when they came out back in the day, as I was only ever able to get my hands on the plastic swordsman you got from the starter set, so it feels good to finally have a bunch of these guys painted up. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and I'll be back again soon with something else.